plays out there.
Thank you. Well, for the vulnerable countries, actually, it is adaptation that we must be focused on. Very clearly, how can an island state like Kiribati, yesterday the president was here, think about mitigation when they will be gone in 40 years? Maldives has put a point by going carbon neutral in 10 years, even if they say, the scientists say they will be gone in 40 years as well. What do we do with a country like Bhutan, whose glacial lake outburst floods cause landslides and floods occasionally? What do we do with a country of 90 million Filipinos in the Philippines that wants to do mitigation, but we are a 0.01% polluter and we are not industrialized, so we must do adaptation. Mitigation must be done by everyone, but most especially the developed nations who have caused all this. And therefore, those developed nations must also assist the affected countries, the vulnerable countries, in terms of adaptation. Of course, adaptation funds are controlled by the developing countries, but as suggested by the UN Undersecretary General John Holmes, there must be some percentage of humanitarian aid and ODA allotted, not only for disaster reduction, but also climate change adaptation. And earlier, David mentioned that, of course, we are in a recession. It would be very difficult to impose upon the rich developed nations to contribute to adaptation funds to affected and vulnerable countries. However, a proactive, innovative, out-of-the-box approach could be reassessing parts of the debt and actually finding out which debt could be utilized for debt for nature, debt for reforestation, debt for disaster risk reduction, swap agreements that will not come out of the pocket of developed nations, but are needed and actually could be utilized effectively by the developing nations. So that, I believe, is a doable, implementable solution as long as the developed nations will be willing to assess the hierarchy of debt of developed nations. One of example, I want to be micro and concrete about it. Out of the 1.4 trillion pesos of the Philippine annual budget, 45% goes to debt service. 55% remains for 92 million Filipinos to utilize for social services. The World Bank estimates that 30% of that 55% goes to corruption. That leaves 25, I'm being very honest and candid about it, 25% of the 1.4 trillion goes to social services. That is the reason why people are poor. Not because we are poor, but because there is misallocation, misappropriation, and because there is corruption. So it is weak governance, it is ecosystems decline, it is a lack of focus on what is the essential thing that really makes us poor. And my suggestion, therefore, is of the 45% that we put into debt service, let us assess which are the anomalous debts which were obtained during the martial law years, which are debts which were never really utilized because of bad negotiations. Maybe even if just 2 to 3% of the 45% could be utilized for reforestation, since we have less than 1 million hectares in forests remaining, maybe even 1% for planting of mangroves or to revitalize our coral reefs, being the Amazon of the seas and being the richest of the center of biodiversity in the world. So if the World Bank, the IMF, the United States could think in terms of that, that would be good. And it is nothing new, because the Tropical Conservation Act, a U.S. Congress enacted law, had created the Philippine Tropical Forest Foundation, which allowed $100 million, very small, Philippine debt to the U.S. to be converted into reforestation efforts. So it has been done, it can be done, it must be done, especially during times of recession and the global financial crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jules, you've been looking eager to get back into that. Actually, that is quite a model, isn't it, that may be acceptable in Western capitals?
Yes, I think it is a model, and it is particularly a relevant model for a country like the Philippines, which suffers from a significant burden of foreign debt. it is not necessarily a model that is applicable to all of the needs, because particularly there where you already pointed out, adaptation requires specific investment, cash on the table to increase the levees and the dikes, to improve the water management, to create the agricultural seeds and hand out the agricultural seeds that are resistant to higher levels of drought. There we actually need incremental money, new money, fresh capital, and the debt forgiveness program would not apply so much to those sort of needs.
So you worry that if you went down the debt forgiveness path, Western governments would say that's enough?
Well, certainly the debt forgiveness, the debt forgiveness part could work very well for the forestry side, where you are talking about the preservation of an asset against which you cross off a liability, to speak in finance terms. But in terms of the needs of adaptation, but also the needs for mitigation in those developing countries that play a more significant role in emissions, we will need to see incremental money. And I think all of us have here observed that the amount of incremental money is actually big, but very modest in comparison to what we've seen over the last 9 months going into the financial crisis.
Loren's point is that this is a start.
Yeah.
It's one of the options.
It's an option.
It's not the only option. It's one of the options.
Yeah.
No, I didn't want to interrupt, only because David mentioned me. Yes, it's just one of the options that there are probably a dozen nations that could benefit from this sort of an agreement, yes. But I agree with you. In terms of agriculture, for example, new seeds, let's say flood-resistant rice, or rice that can grow during periods of drought. Those are important products of research and technology which perhaps the third world does not have, which perhaps the first world nations could share in terms of technical assistance. R&D, research and development, science and technology is so essential these days, and that exchange of technology and know-how could be part of the package in terms of helping developing nations. I don't want to take away the floor from you.
Well, just a couple of points on the where do we get the financing from. There's a tendency to think of it as solely having to come from the budgets of the exchequers, if you like, of the developed countries, like development assistance does at the moment. But in the climate change arena, we've seen a number of innovative ways of raising funding that doesn't necessarily have to come from that source. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We have, for example, in the mitigation arena, the Clean Development Mechanism, which enables private sector entities, by and large, in developed countries that have targets to invest in projects in developing countries to reduce their emissions, and thereby give them technology and access to new funds, which are outside the domain of any taxpayer-funded national budgets. Similarly, we have on the adaptation side something called the adaptation levy on these CDM projects, which generates, it's a 2% levy on all the project transactions, which generates funding for something called the Adaptation Fund, which was set up under the Framework Convention. And again, this is for providing adaptation assistance to developing countries, but does not come from developed country exchequers, as it were. And there are a number of proposals on the table from various countries. One of them, for example, from the least developed countries, for a similar adaptation levy to be applied to all international air passenger travel. Air passengers are, one of the polluters. It applies the polluter pay principle. They have a major carbon footprint and have the ability to pay for it. And if you just put a little bit of an adaptation levy on that, would generate in the order of $10+ billion a year for adaptation funds, which would again not be coming out of the national exchequer and a budget. So we need to look at innovative ways of raising the funds.